Hello there, my name's Card. I work in social sciences research, and I've recently taken to making these little, easy listening videos about my thoughts, interests, and observations. You can see that I've given this one a pretty eye-catching title, and what I'm going to do today is first tell a bit of a personal story, then use that as the jumping off point to briefly work through some related lines of thinking. To start with, since my teen years, I've identified as bisexual, because in the course of growing up, I just ended up feeling attraction to the idea of being with both girls and guys. And some cursory research on my own part as to why that was led me to find the right term to articulate that. I say I'm bi because that's the term that fits. And I've had lovely relationships on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. Although now that open quote gender discourse has gone mainstream, if anyone asks, my go-to line has become, it's bi as in bimodal, not bi as in binary. But nowadays we've also got terms that functionally mean the same thing, like pansexual and omnisexual. And if you feel any particular attachment to those terms, more power to you. I'm just going to stick with bi, since that's the label I started with, and any others would just feel like splitting hairs at this point. I couldn't tell you the exact date on which I first made the sudden realization that it was possible for a relationship to be different from the storybook fairy tale one man, one woman norm, but I do remember exactly how it happened. One nondescript lazy afternoon, when I was maybe 13 or 14 years old, I was reading a bunch of these illustrated history books from the 50s. Unfortunately, I can't say for certain which history books in particular they were, although I have gone through plenty in the years since trying to figure it out. But several of the pictures I saw that day really left an impression on me. There were all these biblical era rulers wearing these flowing, bejeweled robes, and classical Greek philosophers in togas, and Roman centurions in essentially flappy little miniskirts. And every king from the Middle Ages to the French Revolution was shown wearing not just some big, great, billowy, colourful outfit, but a load of jewellery and a face full of makeup and silk stockings too. And it really made 14-year-old me stop and think for a minute. And what I was thinking, that honestly it seemed a lot fancier than the somber stuff that we call formal wear today. I might even have been able to write all that off as just the eccentricities of the historical elite and foreigners and pagans and whatnot, or just people in an age before the widespread adoption of real pants, if it weren't for one particular page toward the end of one of these history books. The page in question was just a brief, sanitized overview of the American Revolution. And naturally, it had a few pictures of the American Continental Army militiamen and some British Redcoat regulars. And that's what got to me. Here you had these redcoats. They're just regular men. They're not royalty, they're not religious figures, they're nothing special. Just whoever an 18th century army recruiter could tempt out of the Marlborough breadlines with the promise of regular pay and a bright red outfit. And they were from decidedly after the Anglo race had started spreading relatively modern morals and proper trousers all over the world too. And I immediately picked up on the fact that all these tough, man's man, working class soldiers all had shoulder length, fully braided ponytails. And in that instant, seeing this picture of an 18th century soldier's hair just really put in my mind the notion that all our modern gender norms might just be made up and kind of arbitrary for the first time. And in that instant, seeing this picture of an 18th century soldier's hair just really put in my mind the notion that all our modern gender norms might just be made up and kind of arbitrary for the first time. A few years on from that, I still had the idea in my head. And having always been really interested in history, I was learning more and more, reading more widely on topics like what passed for a normal intimate relationship, during the classical era, through to the recurrent historical prevalence for polygyny. Everything that came out of the Renaissance buried only the barest possible pretext, all the way to figures like Oscar Wilde and Lord Byron. And I know it sounds a bit just so, a little bit Tumblr, then they all clapped, but I think it's arguably fair to say that functionally, seeing a redcoat's ponytail made me queer. That is the earliest possible impactful incident I can point to that started the snowball of me starting to think about sexuality and gender identity in a critical way. As it just so happens, I've been getting into that line of thinking again recently. Probably just because for the last few months, as part of my job, I've been cataloguing ancient Persian artworks through the height of the Australian summer. So that means I've seen a lot of depictions of men in skirts, and I've been thinking about how much that actually makes much more sense in a hot environment than the trousers I wear to work. All that being said, this video isn't actually about that per se. If you'd really like to hear me talk about that sort of stuff, in particular directly, I'd recommend you listen to the audio essay on this very channel a few videos prior to that. It's called Deconstructing Cis-Heteronormativity for Fun and Clout, and it's great stuff. What this video is about, broadly speaking, is why, open quote, representation matters, in everything from popular media to just being visible in everyday life. And in respect to all sorts of minority identities too, not just gender identity and orientation-related ones. Essentially, to that end, there's two main reasons why progressives such as myself say that representation matters. Consider this video the concise explanation, both for anyone not yet on board with this side of the issue, as well as a resource for any leftist who's been struggling to find the best way of explaining it to others. First and foremost, people, especially children, teenagers, and young adults, develop a large amount of their understanding of the wider world nowadays through the media they see, both consciously and subconsciously. In practice, this essentially means a couple things, like that seeing positive portrayals of people who are like you in a way that has been historically marginalized can be very affirming. This is the main reason we encourage creators and storytellers to include people of all sorts of marginalized identities in small everyday roles throughout all our stories, in order to show that we believe everyone is welcome throughout our society, and that to explicitly feature those sorts of marginalized identities in aspirational protagonist and hero roles. The media that people grow up seeing every day, nowadays primarily stuff like TV and movies, for better or worse, is going to shape how people look at the world. That is one of the intended functions of art, and it always has been. Perhaps it's a bit hard to quantify in concrete terms, but the bottom line here is that we all benefit from seeing characters that are like ourselves portrayed as good people in the culture that surrounds us. Most people that have spent years yearning for those sorts of portrayals understand this fairly intuitively. But if you've grown up without having to wonder when or if you'll ever see someone who looks or acts like you on screen, that's a privilege. The most famous example, of course, the one that always gets cited by people making this sort of argument, which I'm also going to cite myself, is Nichelle Nichols' turn on the original Star Trek. Her casting was perhaps the first time ever a black woman was shown on television in a prominent role of importance, which is something so theoretically simple to portray, but had been a long time coming, and which evidently came to inspire countless girls of color to hope for better in life back in the day too. Nichols' character may not have been the first ever black woman on screen, but she was one of the very first that you were supposed to look up to. Representation doesn't just mean having characters of color or any other minority identity on screen being played as comic relief by like white actors in full face makeup, or queer coded characters only being portrayed as stereotypes and villains, and so on and so forth. It means having minority characters that are actually something aspirational for people who will see the media they're in. The other half of why representation is important is essentially because it shows everyone who isn't from a marginalized or minority identity that the people who are still matter. It's for, among others, everyone who, say, still gets mad when a non-white person is announced as the lead in a new movie or series. You know the type. They're the ones who are usually crying in bad faith, something like wishing that people got roles based on merit or some other imagined boogeyman of theirs. It's basically a reactionary dog whistle at this point. Those people haven't yet learned their lesson and apparently still need to be cowed publicly until they do get it. To the people who are getting mad about this sort of thing, Western culture getting equalized feels like a loss of special status. And that's because, to people who before did have a disproportionate amount of space and privilege and representation, to be on a level playing field with everyone else feels like a step down. While, thankfully, we are arguably now beginning to get to the point where we have open quote, fair representation, that's all the more reason that why we progressives should keep pushing. And as much as any single person has virtually no ability to influence the cultural drift, as a consumer bloc, people, broadly speaking, can support particular trends towards inclusive media. Reductively speaking, straight cis white men will, if given the opportunity, almost never seek out narratives that aren't made for, made by, and made about other straight cis white men. Maybe on occasion they'll go for something with a protagonist who doesn't fit exactly one of those descriptors, but that is definitely the exception, not the rule. With this in mind, as terminally online conservatives love to cry, minorities are actually getting an oversized amount of representation nowadays. Good. If the left really has the power to make that happen, I say we should keep pushing until we hit complete saturation with it then. Get as much diversity of casting in every movie and every television show the average chud just spends all their life watching then. Worth mentioning too that video games are now, by some estimates, the biggest consumer product. So get in there too. If anything, the amount of unwashed reactionaries that came out of Gamergate a few years ago proves that on the whole, gamers still require a lot of work. Although we haven't yet gotten to the point where visible minorities get near positions of power and influence, that's more or less just a waiting game. Until then, working on the representation can be a fun little side project. And I'm not just talking about demoralizing the reactionaries either here. If you're an actual avowed leftist, you'll know that liberals are just the milquetoast managers of capital, and they're far from being on the same team as us. Even coming from those with the best of intentions, liberalism essentially posits that the biggest fault of bigotry is to deny minorities access to the open market. So feel free to turn that sort of pandering on them and run with it too. If at the very least they're going to offer progressives a visible platform, we might as well seize it for whatever it's worth. Take up space, have fun with it, be aggressively and visibly present. Best case scenario, it normalizes the outgroup just a little bit more. Now, Important as representation for this purpose is, I'd prefer to focus primarily on the positive first type in this video. So, returning to that original idea, as well as that little personal story I told at the start of the video, I'd like to briefly address how representation of identities can impact the individual in practice. Basically, in opening people's eyes up to paths in life they might not have considered otherwise. A lot of what specifically comes to define each of our senses of self is a pretty far from settled science. I, for one, definitely don't buy into the born this way narrative. And I also don't think people are just going to figure out what they want their identity to be in life without seeing some point of reference. It's exposure to these different ideas about what you can be that allows people to start thinking more about these abstract concepts. Citing the idea of a picture you see once and then you're queer forever, for example, might be a bit overly simplistic for most, but it gets the idea across well enough, and it'll make a good, albeit very clickbaity title. Now, there's this conservative fear of a concept called social contagion. It essentially suggests that kids and teenagers are at risk of becoming gay or trans or whatever if they see it on TV or in schools and so on. In a weird way, conservatives here have correctly identified a basic cause and effect relationship, although it should be said that they typically exaggerate how prevalent being gay and trans actually is. Of course, I would also take the position that exploring gender identities and one's sexuality isn't bad. And so, of course, on the whole, it's good that people in that teenage to younger adult age bracket are now increasingly getting that message and are being given the language and a frame of reference to begin thinking about those sort of things to themselves. Someone who simply hasn't been exposed to the notion of deviating from the social default, whether it be related to gender presentation, orientation, or even life and career prospects, or anything else entirely, won't magically come up with these concepts on their own. And in effect, or if you had to describe the process as a third party looking in here, it would appear as though the mere sight of someone who breaks away from those norms is single-handedly converting people away from the social status quo. The usual conservative line here is corrupting the youth. Someone's identity, their traits, their preferred lifestyle, and so on, isn't a predefined thing that someone's born with that they just need to discover per se. It's an ever-shifting idea that can vary, even day to day or with a different social group from another, and it's up to each person to create and define that for themselves. People, in aggregate and individually, are very adaptable. The post-Second World War white picket fence, nuclear family shtick wasn't some primordial truth reasserting itself in the 50s and 60s. And the norms of 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 6,000, whatever, weren't either. The possibilities are in reality endless, and the truth here can be whatever you want it to be. And that new truth can easily become the new normal. We are now, fortunately, seeing this sort of come into effect. There is, after all, a reason why perhaps as much as 30% of Generation Z report being some kind of queer. It's not that almost a third of the people coming of age in the last 5 years have any innate difference biologically. It's just that acknowledging that there's actually no reason to stick within the boundaries of open quote normal heterosexuality has become much more normalized in the West. People are products of their society, just as much as society is, on the whole, reflective of the beliefs and attitudes of the people which comprise it. If you raise a kid in a culture that openly tolerates non-straight romance, which is to say, just treats it normally, you're much more likely to get a queer adult down the line. In a repressive conservative culture, with less media representation of diverse personal identities, you'd have far fewer people being openly gay or trans or polyamorous and so on. If you could magically send a baby born today back to ancient Rome or medieval China or pre-Columbian America or anywhere else, they'd grow up understanding that culture as normal without needing to think twice about it. And I'd hope that down the line, we manage to create a culture that completely normalizes all sorts of identities and personal expressions. And we can get there, in large part, by just continuously pushing more and more for that meaningful representation, and keeping in mind how simply existing proudly and openly can inspire plenty of people who see us, young or old, to do the same too. Thank you for listening. I hope you managed to get something as useful out of hearing that as I believe I did in articulating it for you. Until next time, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts, feel free to subscribe or take a look at this YouTube page's back catalogue. But either way, bye for now and have a lovely day.